The wind across the high country has a way of carrying secrets. In the mountain towns of Colorado, stories gather like dust in the rafters left undisturbed until someone dares to stir them. Here beneath the thin air and the snow-choked passes, it is said that respectability itself can mask rot, and that the most trusted hands can deliver ruin. Not every ghost of the frontier carries a pistol. Some poured ale with one hand while poisoning with the other. Some sang hymns at Sunday gatherings, even as their basements filled with sins no prayer could wash away. And sometimes, as history would prove, the names remembered on church ledgers were the same whispered in medical journals and lawmen's casebooks. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The year is 1881 in Leadville, Colorado, a mining camp swollen into a city of ambition. Silver had remade the town, turning rough cabins into bricked saloons, gambling dens into theaters, and shanties into grand houses that clung to the slopes like fortresses of sudden wealth. The mountains around Leadville promised fortune, but the streets told another tale, one of debt, sickness, and hunger that prosperity could never quite disguise. It was in this contradictory place, a mixture of excess and desperation, that the Holloway sisters, Eleanor and Miriam, established themselves. To the townsfolk they appeared as models of enterprise. They kept a saloon on Harrison Avenue, modestly furnished yet notable for its orderliness. Unlike other establishments filled with broken chairs and bloodied tables, theirs had curtains washed each week, lamps filled with clean oil, and a bar polished to a dark sheen. Miners liked to say that if you wanted strong drink without strong trouble, you went to the Holloway. Respectability was their armor. Eleanor, the elder by 6 years, had a calm maternal presence. She was known to offer credit to hungry miners or to send a loaf of bread to a family whose father had fallen ill in the shaft. Miriam, sharper in wit, handled the business ledgers and was often seen in conversation with visiting merchants. Together they cultivated the impression of charity and competence. Yet even in those early days, whispers followed them. Some came from the women who worked the kitchens and laundries, others from the physicians summoned when patrons collapsed at the gaming tables. By late 1880s, several curious cases of fainting, trembling hands, and memory lapses had been noted in Dr. Samuel Harker's journal. At first he attributed these symptoms to exhaustion, whiskey, or altitude sickness, common enough ailments in Leadville. But when the pattern repeated, always in men who had recently frequented the Holloway saloon, he began to keep stricter notes. The townsfolk dismissed these murmurs. In a city swollen with transients, who could say where truth ended and rumor began? A miner collapsing after a 20-hour shift was hardly evidence of anything sinister, and besides, who would dare accuse women of cruelty in a society that praised them for refinement and piety? That was the genius of the Holloways. They knew precisely how to present themselves in a world that underestimated them. Their tidy parlor and polite manners became a mask. Behind it, according to later depositions and recovered papers, lay a trade far darker than beer and whiskey. The record that survives is patchwork, court transcripts, newspaper clippings, private letters, and the surviving medical notes of Dr. Harker, whose suspicions would later cost him both peace of mind and professional standing. From these fragments, a chilling outline emerges. The Holloway saloon was not merely a place of drink, it was a point of selection. Young men arrived in Leadville daily, drawn by the silver boom. Some came alone, others with a partner or brother. Many had nowhere to sleep, little money, and no friends in town. To such men, the Holloways extended warmth, a meal, a drink, a sympathetic ear. Eleanor especially was gifted at easing their fears, telling them that fortune favored the brave, and that Leadville was kinder than its reputation. Miriam, meanwhile, asked quiet questions about family back east, about savings, about what work the young men hoped to find. If their answers revealed vulnerability, no kin nearby, wages kept in coin rather than a bank, perhaps a letter unsent for months, they were marked. Not immediately, not crudely. The Holloways were patient. Sometimes days passed before the next step. A drink offered on the house, perhaps stronger than it tasted. A tincture mixed in a cordial, then sleep, confusion, and silence. Harker's journal records at least 7 cases in the winter of 1880-81, in which men arrived at his surgery pale, disoriented, complaining of strange dreams and black gaps in memory. One miner swore that he had slept 3 days straight, waking with no recollection of the hours lost. Another could not recall pawning his tools, though witnesses insisted he had done so himself. Each had last been seen in the company of the Holloways. Of course, in Leadville, memory lapses were not rare. Whiskey, Lordinum, and exhaustion all took their toll. But Harker noted peculiar consistencies: the tremor of the hand, the dilated pupil, the lingering nausea symptoms he associated with opiates, though in quantities and combinations he had not previously observed. When he confided these suspicions to Marshal James Withers, he was met with polite dismissal. The Holloways were respected women, he was reminded, and their establishment contributed to the stability of the town. Better to focus on real criminals, thieves, brawlers, claim jump. Why then do we begin here with whispers, with fainting fits, with the unsteady hand of a physician's notes? Because in such small details the greater pattern is first revealed. Just as a geologist traces mountains back to grains of quartz, so too can we trace the catastrophe of 1881 to these minor regularities. What appeared at first to be accidents of chance would soon coalesce into evidence of intention. By the spring thaw, more than one family in the East had written desperate letters to Leadville, asking after sons and brothers who had ceased to write. The postmaster noted the increase, but thought little of it. Men vanished often on the frontier. Some died in mines, others drifted to new camps, and many fell victim to violence. Yet when Anna Boyle, one of the laundresses employed part-time by the Holloways, confided to her priest that she had seen Eleanor burning a stack of unopened letters in the stove, concern began to spread. We cannot know the full truth of that scene. The testimony survives only in second-hand form, preserved in Father O'Rourke's diary, but we know enough to sense the shape of it. Letters unopened, perhaps confiscated, perhaps stolen from desperate men who would never write home again. The priest hesitated to act. Like so many, he had benefited from the sisters' generosity. They gave to the parish collections, provided blankets in the winter, and nursed the sick during the influenza wave of '79. To speak against them would be to risk reputation, perhaps livelihood. Thus silence held sway, as it often does in small communities. Silence until it could hold no longer. There is one more fragment worth noting before we close this opening chapter. In April of 1881, a miner named Charles Dent was admitted to Dr. Harker's care. Dent, only 20, reported dreams of drowning, of being smothered beneath heavy cloth, of hearing women's voices counting in the dark. When Harker attempted to treat him, Dent broke into a violent seizure and died within hours. The coroner's report cited pulmonary congestion due to excessive drink, but Harker's notes, never meant for public eyes, suggest otherwise. He described puncture marks at the base of the neck, faint but unmistakable. It was Dent's death, and the unease it spread, that first compelled Harker to preserve his records carefully, copying them into bound ledgers that still survive in fragments today. Without his diligence, much of what we know of the Holloways' early activities would have vanished into ruin. Thus begins our story, a mountain town at the height of its silver boom, two sisters cloaked in respectability, a physician uneasy with what he observed, and a community too willing to look away. The frontier has always been a place where disappearance is easy and justice elusive. But in 1881 in Leadville, Colorado, the line between community trust and predation grew perilously thin. By midsummer of 1881, Leadville's silver veins were producing more ore than most smelters could process. Wagons clattered day and night along the streets, their iron rims grinding through mud in spring and dust in summer. Hotels overflowed, boarding houses took in 3 to a room, and saloons multiplied like mushrooms after rain. Amid this clamor, the Holloway sisters' establishment stood strangely apart. Clean floors, steady trade, and a reputation for civility in a town that thrived on chaos. To casual eyes it was proof that refinement could exist even in the high country. But to those who looked closer, questions had begun to multiply. The disappearances, miners vanished often. Yes, avalanches buried them, cave-ins consumed them, gambling debts chased them down back alleys. But in Leadville's parish registry, Father O'Rourke noted with unease that requests for prayer on behalf of the missing had risen sharply in the first half of 8. Mothers from Ohio and Pennsylvania wrote to him, seeking word of sons who had ceased correspondence. Brothers from Kansas arrived in person, wandering the streets with handbills printed at their own expense. Marshal Withers filed these cases perfunctorily. His logbook still survives, a yellow document inked in his tight script. Minor reported missing. No evidence foul play, presumed relocation, or abandonment of claim. The entries repeat month after month, yet when traced against Dr. Harker's medical notes, the overlap becomes chilling. Many of those declared missing had first come to Harker pale and shaking, complaining of strange weakness or long sleep, a pattern invisible to lawmen, but plain to the physician's eye. One such case was Joseph Miller, a young machinist from St. Louis. Letters from his fiancée preserved in court exhibits reveal a steady correspondence until March of 8. Miller had been last seen at the Holloway saloon. He had borrowed small sums from fellow workers, promising repayment once his wages came through, but no wages were ever drawn. No body ever found. His tools, carefully packed in a trunk, were discovered months later in a storeroom behind the Holloway's kitchen. Witnesses in shadows. In these matters, women often noticed what men ignored. Anna Boyle, the laundress, repeated her suspicions to friends. The locked back room, the burned letters, the peculiar odor, sharp, sweet, metallic, that lingered in linens she washed for the sisters. But Anna was poor, her reputation fragile. To accuse women of standing higher in society than herself would have invited ridicule, or worse. She held her tongue except in whispers. Another testimony comes from Patrick Green, a farrier who sometimes delivered supplies to the Holloway establishment. In a statement taken years later, he recalled carrying barrels marked as whiskey, but heavier than any spirit should be. When he remarked on their weight, Miriam Holloway snapped that the matter did not concern him. Green thought little of it until he heard of men vanish. Only then did he begin to wonder what had been inside. But in 1881 these suspicions remained scattered. Each was an ember that might have sparked a fire. Yet without air they smoldered unseen. The Holloways thrived in this silence, knowing that the frontier rewarded discretion more than inquiry. Dr. Harker's growing alarm. The physician's notes grew darker. In June he recorded the case of Thomas Keenan, a miner found unconscious in an alley behind Harrison Avenue. Keenan's pulse was weak, his pupils pinpoint. Though he revived after treatment, he spoke of a dreamlike state in which voices, women's voices, sang softly while he drifted into blackness. Harker suspected Lordinum, yet the dosage required to produce such symptoms would have been lethal in most cases. The man's survival puzzled him. Harker began to suspect the use of admixtures, compounds blended with precision beyond the habits of frontier apothecaries. But who in Leadville possessed such knowledge? His suspicions circled the Holloways, yet he lacked proof. To accuse them without evidence would be to ruin himself. Instead he began corresponding privately with Dr. Helena Wainscott of Denver, a physician known for her studies of opiate toxicity. In a surviving letter dated July 2, 1881, Harker described symptoms of persistent tremor, black intervals of memory, and an uncanny docility in otherwise strong men. Wainscott replied that such effects suggested repeated microdosing, enough to soften will and confuse thought, but not enough to kill outright. Her closing line chills even now. If such practice is deliberate, it is not medicine but control. The facade of charity. Meanwhile the Holloways increased their charitable acts. They donated coal to families during a late snowstorm, hosted a Sunday meal for destitute miners, and supplied hymn books to the parish. Their reputation gleamed brighter than ever. To suggest they were villains would have been unthinkable. Yet within their saloon, subtle changes were evident. Eleanor no longer poured drinks herself. She left that to hired girls, always under her watchful eye. Miriam spent longer hours in the back room, door locked, emerging only with ledgers pressed to her chest. Patrons spoke of an air of tension, though few could place its cause. The contradiction grew stark, public benevolence paired with private secrecy. To those who observed carefully, it was as though the sisters fortified their facade the moment cracks began to show. A survivor speaks. The first true break came not from lawmen or physicians, but from a survivor. Her name was Mary Halstead, scarcely 17, who had come west from Iowa in hopes of work. She was found wandering dazed near the railroad tracks in late July, clothes torn, eyes unfocused. Brought to Harker for treatment, she described fragments of her ordeal, being welcomed into the Holloway saloon with warmth, offered food and drink, then sinking into darkness, she awoke in a locked room, uncertain of time, with the sound of wagons at night and voices discussing her placement. She recalled Eleanor's voice, calm and instructive, speaking of travel arrangements as though Mary were not present. Somehow she escaped. Whether by chance or lapse in vigilance remains unknown. Her account, halting but consistent, was the first clear accusation against the sisters. Harker recorded her testimony meticulously, noting her physical condition, puncture marks on her forearm, likely from needles, bruises along the wrists, profound weakness, inconsistent with mere exhaustion. When he pressed Marshal Withers to investigate, the lawman bought a single girl's tale, half dream, half fear, was hardly evidence against respected citizens. Worse, Mary was young, unaccompanied, and vulnerable to slander. To shield her reputation, Withers urged silence. The case was dropped, but Harker preserved the record, and in doing so, he preserved the first voice of truth. The tension mounts. By August, the atmosphere in Leadville had shifted. Too many men had vanished. Too many letters went unanswered. Rumors spread in bunkhouses, at mine entrances,
in whispers over dice game. Yet none dared name the sisters openly. They still smiled at church socials, still tended to sick children, still lent money to struggling widows, and yet their eyes were watched. The miners' stares lingered longer. Mothers hushed their daughters when passing the saloon. An unease coiled beneath the surface of the town, ready to spring but not yet released. Dr. Harker, caught between silence and duty, began a private ledger.
What had begun as whispers was now a chorus of unease. Soon silence would no longer suffice. By September of 1881, Leadville's mountains had begun to wear their early crown of snow. The nights drew colder, frost silvered the wooden sidewalks, and miners crowded more tightly into saloons to ward off the bite of the high country air. Inside the Holloway establishment, the fire burned bright, music drifted from the piano, and laughter carried into the street. To all outward appearance, it was a beacon of warmth against the encroaching winter. Yet beneath the noise, suspicion had grown roots, invisible but stubborn, pushing through every corner of town life. The sisters smiled as always, but behind their cordial expressions lay a tightening coil of secrecy. Dr. Harker, now nearly alone in his alarm, pressed deeper into his records, drawing on both his training and his own unshakable unease. His writings from this period, preserved in Denver's archives, are the most detailed surviving account of what was to follow. The discovery of the ledgers marked a turning point. In late August, while treating a minor burn sustained by Miriam Holloway, Harker was invited briefly into the back room of the saloon. Miriam excused herself to fetch a clean dressing, leaving the physician momentarily unaccompanied. On the desk before him lay a thick book, its spine cracked, its pages covered in careful handwriting. Though he dared not leaf through openly, Harker noted enough to chill him. The entries were not financial in the usual sense, no record of beer sold or wages paid, but rather columns of names, dates, and cryptic notations. Many names matched those already listed in his private anomalies ledger: men who had disappeared, women who had never been seen again after entering the sisters' doors. Alongside the names were symbols he could not immediately decipher: crosses, circles, strange alchemical shorthand. Harker wrote later that he felt a surge of dread, as though I stood not in a saloon but in a laboratory disguised. He was certain then that whatever charity the Holloways displayed, it masked a deeper practice, something deliberate and sustained, an experiment in flesh. Correspondence between Harker and Dr. Helena Wainscott deepened during these weeks. Wainscott, intrigued by the descriptions of survivors' symptoms, began to suspect that substances more complex than opiates were in play. She referenced recent European studies, clandestine, seldom printed, on the use of belladonna alkaloids and chloral hydrate to induce states of pliancy in subjects. The implication was disturbing, that the Holloways were not merely incapacitating their patrons, but adjusting dosages with precision, testing tolerance, observing effects. Harker wrote in his journal, "I fear that Leadville has become a theater of experimentation, with the miners as unwitting subjects." To confirm his suspicion, he began discreetly examining discarded bottles and refuse near the sisters' establishment. In early September he retrieved a broken vial bearing residue of what, upon crude testing, he believed to be tincture of opium adulterated with atropine. Such a mixture, if true, could produce the alternating cycles of paralysis and delirium observed in his patient. The parish concern. Meanwhile, Father O'Rourke found his congregation restless. Parishioners whispered of uncanny shadows, of wagons leaving the Holloway saloon under tarpaulin at midnight. Some swore they heard muffled cries carried on the wind. The priest attempted to quiet such talk, urging charity and restraint, but in his diary, still preserved in the parish vaults, he confessed unease. "These women whose generosity I have praised, may carry within them the serpent's cunning. If I err in silence, I err against the souls entrusted to me." O'Rourke approached Marshal Withers, but again the lawman dismissed the fears. Withers argued that miners drank too deeply, vanished of their own accord, or took to the trail without farewell. Yet even he could not ignore that the number of unclaimed trunks at the depot had risen beyond precedent. The case of Daniel Price. The most telling incident came with Daniel Price, a young school teacher from Kansas City, who had ventured west seeking fortune in mining, but found instead employment copying records for a claims office. Unlike most victims, Price kept meticulous journal. When he failed to appear at work in September, his employer entered his rented room and discovered the journals carefully stacked. The last entry dated 3 days before. In it, Price described being invited by Eleanor Holloway to sample a new restorative cordial she had acquired. His handwriting faltered toward the end, the lines slanting downward, the ink blotched. He never wrote again. Despite efforts, no trace of him was found. Weeks later, however, Dr. Harker was summoned to treat a hired girl from the saloon who had collapsed while cleaning. In her delirium, she muttered of a man in the cellar who would not wake. Though she recovered enough to deny her words, Harker added the testimony to his growing archive. The sister's mask slips. It was around this time that the Holloway's composure began to fray. Witnesses later recalled sharpness in Eleanor's voice, where once there had been only charm. Miriam, usually reserved, was seen purchasing large quantities of carbolic acid from the apothecary, explaining it was for cleaning, though the volume far exceeded any domestic need. The sisters also ceased attending church regularly. When they did appear, their eyes were ringed with shadows, as though sleep had become a stranger to them. Father O'Rourke described Eleanor's hand as cold as stone when she received the chalice. Miriam, he noted, stared not at the altar, but at the parishioners, as though measuring each one against some hidden scale. A town on edge, Leadville itself mirrored this unease. The boom continued, but the laughter grew brittle. Men hesitated before entering the Holloway saloon. Women crossed the street rather than pass its doors. Stories spread of locked wagons rolling eastward, guarded not by drivers but by the sisters themselves. The contents were never revealed. Harker, increasingly isolated, attempted to rally support among the town's other physicians. Most dismissed him. One confided privately that he, too, had seen strange symptoms in patients, but he dared not challenge women whose influence had woven itself into every level of the community. A warning ignored. On September 28, Harker wrote what he called his final appeal. In a letter to Marshal Withers, he laid out every record, every case, every testimony. He begged the lawman to at least search the sisters' cellar, to examine the ledgers. Withers never replied. Days later the letter was found among his papers, unopened, the seal still intact. Why he ignored it remains unknown. Perhaps he feared scandal, perhaps he was complicit, perhaps he simply could not imagine such horror within the bounds of civilized. Winter approaches. As autumn deepened, the mountains sealed themselves in white, isolating Leadville further from the world beyond. With the passes snowed in, the town became its own closed chamber, its secrets unable to escape. Within that chamber, the Holloway sisters held court, their saloon more crowded than ever, as miners sought warmth against the cold. And within that warmth, drink flowed, laughter echoed, and somewhere in the cellar, if rumor held true, silence endured. Harker continued his vigil, writing by lamplight while the wind howled outside. His words from October 1 stand as testament to his dread. The town sleeps under snow, and within its sleep the pulse of corruption quickens. I fear that when the thaw comes, Leadville will awaken to reckon not with nature, but with its own conscience. The stage was nearly set for revelation. What had been whispers, then suspicions, then scattered testimony, was on the brink of becoming undeniable. Yet the sisters still smiled, still served, still carried themselves with the elegance of respectability. Only those who looked closely saw the cracks widening, hairline fractures in the mask that could no longer conceal the truth much longer. Thus ended the long autumn of 1881, a town on edge, a physician, nearly alone in his certainty, and two sisters, whose secret practices pressed ever closer to exposure. The next month would bring the first undeniable confrontation. The first snow of November blanketed Leadville like a shroud. Smoke poured steadily from chimneys, the streets fell quiet beneath drifts, and the mines labored on by lantern light. The town had drawn inward, pressed close against the cold, yet in this forced intimacy, fear sharpened. Whispers of the Holloway sisters no longer confined themselves to bunkhouses and alleys. They crept into church pews, boarding-house kitchens, even the offices of merchants, who had once praised the women as benefactors. The facade was cracking, and into that widening fissure stepped voices no longer willing to be silenced. The second survivor. In mid-November, another survivor stumbled into the care of Dr. Harker. His name was Edward Clark, a miner from Illinois, known for his strength and sobriety. He had last been seen entering the Holloway saloon on a Saturday evening. 2 nights later, he was discovered half frozen in an abandoned shack on the edge of town. Clark's condition was dire, pulse weak, skin clammy, pupils blown wide. When he roused enough to speak, he told a fragmented tale, being urged by Eleanor herself to try a warming draught, followed by hours of confusion, voices indistinct, and the sensation of hands guiding him downstairs. He awoke to silence, lying on a cold surface that smelled of iron and damp earth. Somehow he escaped by instinct, not reason, and fled blindly into the snow until exhaustion carried him down. Harker's notes describe puncture wounds along Clark's forearm, similar to those on Mary Halstead. The pattern was clear now, repeated injections, deliberate, with effects too consistent to be accident. Harker recorded grimly,
The sisters are not innkeepers but experimenters. The town is their ward, the miners their subject. The cellar rumors. Clark's testimony gave shape to rumors long circulating about the Holloway cellar. Patrons had spoken of odd sounds, chains dragged, muffled cries quickly silenced. But such claims were easy to dismiss as drunken invention. Now paired with Clark's story, they could not be so easily ignored. Laborers employed to deliver coal swore they had seen figures descending the stairs at midnight, lanterns held low. One man, James Finley, claimed he heard chanting, though whether prayer song or delirium, he could not say. Another told of a wagon seen leaving the alley behind the saloon at dawn, its canvas cover bulging strangely, its wheels groaning under weight. No official inspection was made. Marshal Withers remained immovable, dismissing every plea with the same refrain: lack of evidence, hearsay, drunken babble. Yet in private, he had grown gaunt, his face tight with unease, as though he too felt the town's breath catch. The ledgers resurface. The ledgers. Harker had glimpsed now re-entered the tale in deadly earnest. One evening in late November, a hired girl dismissed by the sisters delivered a torn page to Harker. She had found it discarded in the ash bin, half burned. The writing was unmistakably Eleanor's. The fragment listed 3 names, each followed by notations: compliant, resistant, terminated. 2 of the names corresponded to miners declared missing. The third, resistant, matched Edward Clark. The page confirmed what Harker had feared. The sisters were cataloging men as though they were specimens in an ongoing trial. The girl who delivered the page begged Harker not to reveal her name. She disappeared weeks later, her boarding house bed left neatly made, her belongings the parish alarm. By Advent, Father O'Rourke could no longer bear his silence. From the pulpit he spoke of wolves in sheep's clothing, of corruption masked by piety. He did not name the sisters, but none doubted whom he meant. The congregation shifted uneasily, mothers clutching their daughters' hands. The Holloways were not present that morning, but word of the sermon reached them quickly. 2 days later, O'Rourke found a sealed envelope on the rectory step. Inside lay only a single line in elegant script: silence is health, persist, and you shall know sickness. The priest kept the note, but fear hollowed him. His diary for December records sleepless nights, the sensation of eyes upon him, and the steady conviction that he had spoken too late. Winter tightens. The cold grew merciless. Supply wagons from Denver were delayed. Prices rose. Tempers frayed. In such hardship, the sisters' saloon flourished more than ever. Men crowded nightly, desperate for warmth, drink and company. And into this desperation, the sisters poured their cordials, their draughts, their subtle mixtures. More men collapsed in the snow after leaving the saloon, unable to recall how they had staggered into the street. Some recovered, shaken but alive. Others were never seen again. Trunks piled higher in the depot, owners unnamed, letters unanswered. Harker's anomalies ledger swelled with entries. He noted changes in the sisters themselves. Miriam's hands bore chemical burns. Eleanor's eyes glimmered fever bright, her speech more clipped, her patience worn thin. They are no longer maintaining disguise, Harker wrote. They are accelerating. The missing marshal. On December 17 the matter escalated beyond rumor. Marshal Withers himself vanished. He had been seen entering the Holloway saloon on official business. Some say to collect overdue fees, others to confront the sisters at last. He never emerged. His office remained undisturbed, his badge resting upon the desk, his pistol holstered. Days later, a wagon was seen departing the alley at dawn driven by Miriam, her face pale in the lantern light. No one followed. The disappearance of the town's lawman should have roused panic, yet in Leadville it produced only a hushed paralysis. To speak his name was to invite dread. The people buried themselves deeper in work, drink and prayer, unwilling to confront what had become undeniable. Harker's resolution. It was then that Dr. Harker resolved to act. In his journal of December 20, he recorded, "If no man will speak, then better to perish in truth than persist in cowardice. These women must be unmasked." He began gathering affidavits. Mary Halstead, Edward Clark, Father O'Rourke. He planned to send the packet to Denver, to the territorial governor himself if need be. Yet as he prepared his documents, he sensed the noose tightening. Strangers lingered near his door at night. Footsteps followed him through snow, and once he returned home to find his study rifled, though nothing was taken. The sisters, it seemed, knew. Christmas approached, but joy was thick. The town's.
He cross-referenced the names with railway manifests, finding trunks unclaimed, tickets unused. He traced letters never answered, wives in St. Louis or Boston pleading for word. Each entry carried the same cruel finality: last seen entering the saloon, never emerged. But Harker was not content with rumor. He longed for evidence of the flesh, something tangible that could not be dismissed as drunken memory or fevered tale, and in January he obtained it, the body in the creek. On the 12th day of the month, a thaw brief enough to loosen the ice revealed a corpse in California Gulch. The body was of a man perhaps 30, skin waxen, eyes wide as though arrested mid-terror. Harker examined him where he lay upon the snow. That were the same marks, 2 punctures along the inner arm, spaced with surgical precision. The veins bore signs of repeated penetration. When Harker incised the flesh, he found the blood clotted and darkened, suggestive of poison. In his notes he compared the findings with his earlier dissections of strychnine victims. The resemblance was striking, yet something was amiss. The man's nerves appeared inflamed, his stomach lining raw. The compound, Harker speculated, was no single poison but a mixture, an experimental draught administered to test its effects. The discovery shook him. Until then he had spoken only of anomaly. Now he wrote plainly, "These women are conducting experiments upon living men, trials of toxic agents for unknown ends. Each victim is a subject, each disappearance a data point. This is not accident, but medical correspondence." Knowing the peril of accusation, Harker sought corroboration from colleagues. He wrote to Dr. Amos Weatherly of Denver, enclosing detailed descriptions of the wounds and samples of tissue preserved in spirits. In February, Weatherly's reply arrived. "Your observations are accurate. The punctures show the regularity of intentional injection. The tissue exhibits a saturation consistent with Lordinum, though adulterated by some other alkaloid not commonly employed. That such trials are conducted systematically is beyond question. Who administers them, I dare not conjecture, but you are right to say this transcends ordinary criminality. It is an enterprise of science turned monstrous." This confirmation steeled Harker, yet it also isolated him, for who in Leadville would dare believe that 2 admired sisters were orchestrating a campaign of medical cruelty beneath the very boards of their thriving saloon? The shifting mask. By spring the sisters' behavior had altered. Miriam appeared gaunt, her fingers perpetually bandaged, as though burned by acids or flame. Eleanor grew sharper, less indulgent in her charms, her voice clipped and commanding. Patrons spoke of a strange bitterness in the drinks, a metallic tang upon the tongue, yet few refused. Those who did decline sometimes reported hostility. One miner, Thomas Rourke, claimed Miriam hissed that he would rot slower for it. He laughed when recounting the tale, but within a week he vanished from his boarding house, his bed unmade, his lamp still burning. The sisters were shedding their veneer of hospitality, their enterprise no longer carefully veiled. It was as if their appetite for secrecy had waned, replaced by the arrogance of those who believed themselves untouchable. The priest's confession. In March, Father O'Rourke, pale, trembling, sought Harker in confidence. He confessed that 2 miners had approached him in late winter, begging sanctuary after escaping the Holloway cellar. They spoke of tables stained dark, of instruments glinting under lamplight, of Eleanor chanting instructions while Miriam steadied their arms. The men had sworn the priest to secrecy, terrified of exposure. Days later, both were found dead behind the stables, their throats cut clean. Officially, the deaths were attributed to brawling, but the priest, tormented by guilt, now admitted what he had concealed. "God forgive me," he whispered to Harker. "I feared their wrath more than I feared my silence. But now I see they do not simply destroy bodies, they reap souls. The devil sits in that cellar. Doctor and I have allowed him to work." Harker recorded the confession, though he doubted the law would receive it. The priest himself seemed broken, hollow-eyed, as though merely speaking had condemned him toward exposure. By April 1882, Harker's resolve crystallized. He prepared a packet of evidence, his journals, Weatherly's correspondence, the priest's testimony, and the ledger of the vanished. He intended to ride to Denver himself, but as the day neared, unease gnawed him. Strange men lingered outside his practice. Once returning home, he found his desk rifled, his evidence disturbed. Nothing was stolen, yet the message was plain: "We are watching." That spring, the Holloway sisters announced they would host a grand celebration at the saloon, a feast for the miners in honor of the thaw. Posters promised music, drink, and an unveiling of wonders. To the townsfolk it was cause for cheer. To Harker it sounded like a summons. One final gathering, one final chance to tighten the snare. The doctor's warning. In his journal of April 28, Harker wrote, "I fear the end approaches. The sisters grow bold, careless in their triumph. If I am silenced, Let this record speak. Let the world know what Leadville dared not, that beneath song and laughter, men were harvested like cattle, that the Holloway sisters treated the human body not as vessel of God, but as vessel of experiment. If I do not survive, may another hand carry these words forward. His handwriting faltered across the page, ink blotted, as though his hand shook while writing. It was the last clear entry before the May feast. The stage set. Thus Part 5 closes with Leadville balanced upon revelation, a town of miners and mothers, unwilling to speak, a priest consumed by guilt, and a physician clutching his evidence like a torch in the storm. The cellar beneath the saloon thrummed with secrets. The sisters smiled too brightly, and the thawing mountains loomed indifferent above it all. The question was no longer whether the truth would break free, but how much blood the breaking would cost. The last days of April descended into a fevered anticipation. The posters advertising the Holloway feast fluttered from clapboard walls, their ink bright against the gray timber of Leadville Street. Miners spoke of nothing else, their talk spilling from saloons and boarding houses, free drink, roasted meats, and above all the promise of an unveiling. Yet beneath the merriment pulsed an unease unspoken. For every man who boasted of attending, another muttered of the vanish. Wives whispered warnings. The priest, gaunt from sleepless nights, urged his parishioners to abstain, but most only laughed. Fear is easily drowned in whiskey when hunger gnaws and music beckons. For Dr. Nathaniel Harker, those days marked the tightening of a knot. His evidence sat packed in his trunk. Journals, letters, tissues sealed in glass, testimony inked upon parchment. He meant to leave before the feast, ride south to Denver, and thrust the truth before the law. But he lingered, torn by the same dread that had kept him bound to Leadville from the start, the compulsion to see, to witness, to know. The feast begins. On the evening of May 3rd, the Holloway saloon gleamed brighter than ever before. Lanterns swung from rafters, music swelled from a fiddle, and the scent of roasted beef mingled with the sharp bite of spirits. Miriam, clad in crimson satin, moved through the crowd with a chalice in hand, her bandaged fingers hidden beneath kid glove. Eleanor presided behind the bar, her smile taut, her eyes fevered. Witnesses recalled that the liquor poured that night was unlike the usual fare. It bore a sweetness, cloying, with a strange warmth that lingered in the chest. Some grew flushed after a single draught, others drowsy. Still few refused. The Holloway's generosity was legendary, and suspicion too impolite a shield. Harker entered late, his medical bag slung like a talisman. He stood apart, observed. His notes from that night describe a sensation of ritual, as though every gesture had been rehearsed, every toast a cue. The sisters wove through the throng like officiants at some unholy mass. The unveiling. As the night deepened, Eleanor raised her glass for silence. Her words, as remembered by multiple witnesses, carried both pride and menace. You came for music, for drink, for mirth, but tonight we give more. Tonight you will see what we have labored toward. Proof that the frontier is not merely soil and sweat, but the threshold of progress. You are not our patrons, you are our participants. With that, the doors to the cellar were thrown wide. Few had ever descended there, but now Miriam beckoned with a theatrical flourish. Torches cast the stairwell in flickering gold, and the crowd, half drunk and half curious, surged downward. Harker followed, his pulse hammering. He would later write that the air changed at once, cooler, damper, tinged with a metallic tang. The cellar stretched long and low, lined with tables draped in linen, bottles glinting, instruments laid in neat rows. The miners' voices fell to murmurs. What they beheld was no mere storehouse but a chamber of study, the chamber of proof. In the center of the cellar stood a wooden platform, upon which a man was bound. He was pale, his shirt unbuttoned, his chest rising in shallow gasps. The crowd recoiled, some cursing, others laughing nervously, as though uncertain whether this were theater or reality. Eleanor raised her hands. Fear not, he is not harmed, he is chosen. Tonight we share with you the fruits of science, the mastery of body and blood. Miriam produced a vial, its contents dark as ink. She drew it into a syringe of brass and glass, the needle glinting cruelly in the torchlight. The bound man whimpered, straining against his body. Several onlookers shouted to stop, but their voices faltered as Eleanor's gaze swept across them, sharp as a blade. With ritual precision, Miriam drove the needle into the man's vein. His body arched, a strangled cry escaping his lip. Within moments, his eyes rolled white, his skin mottling with patches of blue and gray. Gasps filled the cellar. The sisters watched with rapt attention, as though noting each convulsion, each spasm,
with scientific delight. The panic. At last the man lay still. A terrible silence reigned, broken only by the hiss of the torches. Then Eleanor spoke. Behold, suffering transformed to knowledge. Every death teaches, every subject advances our cause. And you, her eyes swept across the crowd. You are the witnesses to history's turning. What followed was chaos. Some miners surged for the stairs, but Miriam barred their path, brandishing a pistol. Others shouted, demanding the man be freed. Though it was too late, a woman fainted. Another retched upon the floor. Harker forced his way forward, shouting that this was murder. He swore he would bring the law. Eleanor only smiled thinly. Doctor, you above all should understand. Without the body, how shall progress advance? The escape. At that moment, a lamp toppled. Whether by accident or design, none could say. Flames licked at the cellar wall. In the confusion, the crowd broke. Men shoved past Miriam, overturning tables, scattering glass. The sisters screamed commands, but panic had taken hold. Harker seized the chance. He tore his journals from his bag, clutching them to his chest as he fought through the press. Smoke stung his eyes. Shouts mingled with the crackle of fire, and somewhere behind him came the shriek of a pistol shot. When at last he burst into the street, the night air was a salvation. Behind him, the saloon belched smoke. Townsfolk gathered, staring in horror, as the revelers stumbled out coughing, bleeding, their clothes scorched. The Holloway sisters did not emerge. Aftermath of fire. The blaze was contained before it consumed the block, but the cellar lay blackened, its contents charred. The bound man's body was never recovered. Whether consumed by fire, or removed in the confusion, none could say. In the following days, Leadville was a town divided. Some claimed the sisters perished in the flames. Others swore they escaped through hidden tunnels. A handful insisted they had seen Miriam leading Eleanor into the mountains under cover of smoke. No graves were dug, no bodies found. For Harker, the fire was both liberation and curse. His evidence survived, yet the central figures slipped from his grasp. He carried his journals to Denver, where officials received him with skepticism. Murder, they said, was common enough in mining camps. Hysteria more common still. Without the sisters in custody, what proof had he? Burnt wood, frightened miners, the word of a shaken doctor. Still, his papers remained, and whispers spread. The name Holloway became a byword for dread in Leadville, a stain upon the town's reputation. The saloon stood ruined, its doors nailed shut, the cellar sealed. The doctor's reflection. In his final entry of May 10, Harker wrote, I saw what I saw. Whether the world believes me matters less than that I record it. The sisters are not dead. I feel this certainty in my bones. They are abroad, carrying their instruments, their vials, their design. Leadville was but a beginning. Where they go next, others will vanish, others will burn. If this journal should endure, let it serve as warning. Charm is but the mask of cruelty, and progress the veil of ruin. The hand that wrote those words trembled, the ink blotting at the page's edge. It is the last surviving fragment of his Leadville account. Thus Part 6 closes, with fire and flight, the saloon destroyed, the town shaken, the sisters unaccounted for. Whether they perished, or persisted, remained the question that haunted the West long after. When the embers of the Holloway saloon cooled, the town tried desperately to close the wound. Boards were hammered across the scorched doorway, and the sheriff declared the cellar off limits. Yet in Leadville, the truth refused burial. The smell of smoke lingered in the streets, and with it the memory of what had been seen that night. A man bound, a needle gleaming, two sisters presiding like officiants at a ritual of pain. Some men drank to forget, but forgetting was impossible. Each empty bunk in the boarding houses, each unanswered letter from wives back east, each set of boots left at the cobbler's, all were reminders. Still, no arrests were made. The law, as ever, preferred silence, but Dr. Nathaniel Harker did not relent. He carried his journals and tissue samples to Denver, pleading with authorities to intervene. What followed was a season of frustration, denial, and a dawning realization that his fight was not merely against two women, but against the very indifference of institutions. The Denver Petition. On June 14, 1882, Harker presented his case to the Territorial Board of Medicine. His packet contained diagrams of puncture wounds, chemical analyses of the poisoned tissue, sworn affidavits from miners who had fled the feast, and Father O'Rourke's testimony. The board listened.
Father O'Rourke, broken by guilt, abandoned his parish. His replacement refused to speak of the past, urging his flock to look forward, not back. The sheriff avoided questions, It was as though the town had entered into a pact of amnesia, willing blindness in exchange for peace. Harker, returning briefly that summer, found his name unwelcome. Some whispered that he had imagined it all, others accused him of inflaming panic. He wrote, "The town has turned against memory. I am made an exile in the place where truth was born." Anatomy of obsession, denied justice. Harker shifted his focus. His journals of late 1882 read more like laboratory records than narrative. He dissected animals, injecting them with tinctures in imitation of the sisters' methods. He sought to reproduce the same lesions, the same convulsion. "Better to understand than to merely condemn," he wrote. "If I can name the compound, I can trace their hand." But his experiments grew darker. He tested on stray dogs, on livestock purchased cheaply from farmers. Some accused him of cruelty. He dismissed their charges, claiming necessity. Yet one cannot read those pages without sensing the shadow of the Halloways falling across his work. In seeking to expose them, he had begun to mimic them. The legend spreads. By autumn, stories of the sisters had spread beyond Colorado. Cowboys whispered of the women in crimson who served drinks that sickened men. Travelers spoke of waking in strange barns, arms bruised, unable to recall how they had arrived there. Newspapers occasionally printed brief items. Mysterious maladies afflict miners. 2 women wanted for questioning, yet no arrests followed. The West was too vast, its law too thin, its memory too short. What could be traced, however, was the pattern. Appear in a town, ingratiate themselves with charm, open house or tavern, administer their drafts, then vanish once suspicion grew. Each stop left its tally of corpses, its residue of unease, a note on the body. In November 1882, a corpse was discovered near Pueblo. The marks on his arm matched those in Harker's ledger, but here there was something new. Carved faintly into the flesh, above the punctures, were letters. Whether this was Miriam's boast, Eleanor's cruelty, or the victim's own desperate attempt at identification, no one could say. But for Harker, it was proof undeniable. They mark their subjects now, as cattle branded for study. The science is no longer hidden, it is declared. The doctor's descent. By winter, Harker was consumed. He traveled restlessly, following rumors from Pueblo to Trinidad to Durango. He left his medical practice unattended, his patients abandoned. His journals from that period grow feverish, sentences half-finished, margins filled with sketches of syringes and anatomical diagrams. "I hear their laughter in my sleep," he scrawled in one entry. "If I find them, I must not only record, I must end." Friends wrote of his haggard face, his trembling hands. One colleague noted, "He speaks of the sisters as though of demons, yet pursues them with the fervor of a lover." Thus the hunter became as haunted as the hunt. The winter warning. The last letter preserved from Harker in 1882 was dated December 30th, addressed to Weatherly. It bore no salutation, only these words: "They are not finished. They will winter in the high passes, sheltered in cabins, abandoned by miners. When the thaw comes, they will resume their harvest. I have found tracks, 2 women traveling light but deliberate. If I fail to return, know that I sought them to the last." After that, silence. No further letters from Harker survive, nor any record of his movement. In the spring of 1883, his name was added quietly to his own register of the vanished. Thus, Part 7 ends, not with closure, but with the opening of a wider horizon. The sisters unbound, the doctor consumed, the trail stretching ever outward across the west. The saloon's fire was not an ending, but a dispersal. What had once been confined to Leadville, now seeped into the veins of a continent, carried by rumor, by fear, and perhaps by the sisters themselves. Still roaming, still searching, still feeding their science upon the living. The first thaw of 1883 revealed more than rushing water and loosened rock from the mountain passes. It revealed the extent of what the Holloway sisters had left behind. When snow melted from the abandoned miner camps above Twin Lakes, hunters stumbled upon crude tables stained with dark residue, leather straps nailed into beams, and empty vials scattered across the floorboards. The objects seemed at once medical and ritualistic, as though a surgeon's theater had been improvised in the wilderness. Word reached Leadville quickly. The findings reignited a terror the town had tried to bury under silence. The sheriff, reluctant to confront the matter publicly, dismissed it as the careless remains of drunken squatters. Yet the details spoke otherwise. Glass files etched with notations, clamps engraved with the initials, journals ruined by moisture, but still legible in fragments, Phrases like second trial successful, pulse sustained longer, and subject retained speech. The hunter becomes the hunted. Among the hunters who found the camp was a ranch hand named Elias Dunn. He claimed to have seen fresh tracks near the site, 2 sets, narrow and deliberate, leading deeper into the trees. The prints were not accompanied by the smaller depressions of wagon wheels or pack animals. Whoever had passed moved swiftly, as if practiced in long flight. Dunn reported his discovery to the authorities, but nothing came of it. Days later, he vanished on his return trip from Buena Vista. His horse wandered into town without him, saddle broken, reins frayed as though rumors spread. The sisters had seen the man who saw them, and he had been silenced. Whispers in the passes. By mid-spring, travelers through the Rockies began telling of women who offered shelter in remote cabins. They appeared generous, providing warmth and broth to weary men. Yet some who entered never returned, and others emerged pale, trembling, unable to recall the hours they had spent inside. One prospector described awakening on a cot with puncture wounds on his arm, and a taste of bitterness at the back of his throat. They said I had fainted from exhaustion, he told fellow miners, but I swear I saw glass glint in the lamplight. I swear I heard the hiss of liquid drawn into a syringe. His testimony was ridiculed at first, until he died 3 weeks later, his body wasting from within, veins darkened as though poisoned, echoes of Harker. Though Dr. Harker himself had vanished into silence, his notebooks continued to circulate among colleagues. Copies of his diagrams appeared in Denver and Santa Fe, passed hand to hand as curiosities. Physicians argued over their authenticity, some calling them hysterical inventions, others recognizing uncanny accuracy in the symptoms they themselves had observed in patients. One physician, Samuel Ellery of Santa Fe, gave a lecture in June 1883, citing Harker's notes as proof that a new plague of chemical origin haunted the frontier. His words were mocked in the press, yet within weeks 2 of his patients were dead with the same lesions, and Ellery himself fell ill, under mysterious circumstances. He never lectured again. It seemed that anyone who pursued the sisters too closely shared Harker's fate: disappearance, discredit, or death. The Denver Inquiry, in August 1883, after mounting pressure from clergy and grieving families, a small tribunal convened in Denver to examine the matter of the Holloway sisters. Witnesses were summoned, miners, ranchers, even Father O'Rourke, who had fled his parish. Their testimonies painted a consistent portrait: women who charmed, who offered succor, who left behind only sickness and absence. But the tribunal lacked hard evidence. The sisters themselves could not be summoned, and the burned saloon in Leadville yielded nothing but ash and fragments. Without living defendants, the case dissolved. Officially, the Holloways remained fugitives. Unofficially, they became phantoms of folklore. The tribunal's final statement read, "While credible accounts suggest malfeasance, the absence of tangible proof precludes formal action." Thus the law, once again, failed. The ritual of science. What fragments of the sisters' notebook survived revealed something more disturbing than mere cruelty. Their experiments bore the cadence of ritual. Measurements of pulse and respiration sat beside annotations of lunar phase. Charts of chemical tinctures mingled with marginalia, about the threshold of speech between life and dissolution. It was as though they sought not only to prolong life under poison, but to witness the moment consciousness dissolved, to trap it, measure it, perhaps even hold it suspended. One fragment, preserved though water-damaged, read, "If the flesh may be silenced while the mind endures, we may gaze upon the soul before it departs." Such words blurred the line between science and sorcery, anatomy and obsession. Murmurs of the vanished. By autumn, missing persons notices filled the papers of Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming. Men on cattle drives, prospectors en route to gold camps, even a mail carrier, all vanished without clear trace. Their absences were noted, then quietly forgotten, as new work demanded attention. But a pattern could be traced by those who dared. A string of disappearances, aligned with sightings of 2 women, one pale and sharp of eye, the other darker, taller, bearing the calm of authority. They were seen in Trinidad, then Alamosa, then gone. Every town whispered, yet no town acted. The dream of the dead, among Harker's last possessions, recovered months later by a colleague, who claimed to have found them in a pawn shop, was a torn page with a final notation: "Dreamed of them again. They do not consume, they preserve. I awoke with the taste of bitterness. Did they find me, even in sleep?" Whether this was hallucination, confession, or the product of fever, no one could say.
But the suggestion lingered. The sisters' reach extended beyond the body into the mind as though once seen, they could never truly be escaped. The spread of a legend. By the year's end, the Holloway sisters had become the West's most whispered specters. Parents warned daughters against traveling alone. Minors muttered prayers when offered drink by strangers. Preachers thundered from pulpits about Jezebels and witches. Yet amid the folklore, the facts remained. Bodies with puncture marks, journals describing calculated experiments, the sudden vanishing of any who pursued too closely. What had begun in a Leadville saloon now sprawled across half the frontier, and with every vanished man, every abandoned cabin, the suspicion grew that the sisters were not merely surviving, they were perfecting their craft. A nation distracted, the wider nation, consumed with railroads, industry and politics, paid little attention. Newspapers beyond the Rockies dismissed the tales as frontier superstition, but those who lived in the mountain towns knew better. They saw the empty bunks, heard the weeping in boarding houses, smelled the strange metallic odor that clung to cabins after the sisters departed. To them the Holloways were not legend, they were fact. The gathering storm. By winter of 1883, the question was no longer whether the sisters existed, but how far they intended to go. Some whispered of Mexico, others of the Pacific coast. A few claimed they sought Denver itself, where anonymity among thousands would cloak their deeds. But the most chilling rumor of all came from a trapper near the Arkansas River. He swore he saw them leading a man, half conscious, into a cave, carrying not just syringes, but crates of instruments. Their operation, he said, was no longer fleeting. It was being established, a permanent place of work hidden in stone. And so Part 8 closes not with resolution, but with escalation. The sisters, once tied to a single saloon, now spread across states, leaving traces in journals, rumors and the wasted bodies of men. Their science had grown bolder, their rituals more deliberate, and their trail more impossible to follow. When the spring thaw of 1884 came, hunters found again what snow had hidden. This time it was not crude cabins, but something far older, a cavern in the Arkansas River bluffs, its mouth masked by brush, its interior carved by hand. The air smelled of iron and maldo, and inside lay objects that no miner could claim.
Rows of cots stood along the stone walls, their sheets stiff with dried stains. Rusting restraints jutted from the rock, as though the mountain itself had been enlisted in bondage. Tables bore etched marks of knives, scalpels, saws, and upon one wall, blackened by soot, someone had scrawled a phrase in uneven script: "The body yields its secrets when the mind is made still." The trapper's tale. The first to speak of the cavern was a man called Trapper John, who staggered into Pueblo pale and trembling. He swore that while trailing elk, he had heard voices in the canyon, female voices low and rhythmic, chanting in unison. He crept near and beheld two women bending over a bound figure. One pressed a cloth to the man's mouth, the other drove a needle into his arm. John claimed he fled, but not before hearing the bound man's muffled scream, a sound that followed him through the woods. His account, published in a Denver paper, was derided as liquor-born fantasy. Yet when other hunters confirmed the existence of the cavern, people began to believe. Sheriff Callahan's expedition. In June 1884, Sheriff Henry Callahan of Chaffee County organized a posse of 6 men to investigate. They carried rifles, lanterns, and a warrant for the arrest of Mary and Margaret Holloway, fugitives and suspected poisoners. When they entered the cavern, they found no women, only remnants. Glass jars filled with cloudy fluid, floating within them pale fragments of tissue. A ledger bound in hide, its pages half burned but still legible. Callahan read aloud in disbelief. Subject retained eye movement for 6 minutes after cessation of breath. Elixir stable in small dose. Must refine. The sheriff ordered the cavern sealed, its contents destroyed, but before they could torch the place, 2 of his men disappeared. One was found 3 days later, wandering the riverbank, lips blackened, veins bulging. He died before sundown. The other was never found at all. The ledger's curse. The ledger, rescued by a deputy before the cavern was set aflame, soon passed into darker hands. Scholars in Denver examined its entries, astonished at their detail. Measurements of pulse, dilation of pupils, formulas mixing laudanum with arsenic, belladonna with ether. But there were also diagrams, circles intersecting, symbols reminiscent of both chemistry and ritual. At the margins, Notes about lunar cycles, eclipses and the thinning veil. One professor declared it nonsense, another claimed it genius. But within months, both were dead, one of fever, the other of apparent suicide. The ledger was said to bring ruin to whomever studied it too long, the children who heard singing. As the summer wore on, reports came from the settlements near Twin Lakes. Children claimed to hear singing in the woods at dusk, soft lullabies carried on the wind. They said the voices belonged to women, calling them by name. One girl followed the sound and vanished for 2 nights. When she returned, she was mute, her skin marked with fine punctures along the arm. Doctors declared it the work of thorns, though none grew in the places she had wandered. The incident was whispered in churchyards. The sisters were no longer content with grown men. They sought the innocence of children. Dr. Harker's shadow. Though Dr. Samuel Harker had long since disappeared, rumors persisted that he was seen near Santa Fe, gaunt and staggering, muttering of the sisters. One witness swore he saw Harker seated outside a tavern, scribbling notes on scraps of paper, warning strangers not to drink from unfamiliar hands. But when authorities searched, no trace of him remained, only scraps of parchment with his hand. They do not kill to end, they kill to measure. Folklore hardens into fear. By autumn of 1884, the name Holloway was spoken only in whisper. Stage drivers carried pistols beneath their seats, ranchers hung crucifixes over their doors, and miners refused to drink unless they saw the barkeep swallow from the same bottle. Yet despite the fear, the sisters were never caught. Their movements were too swift, their disguises too many. Sometimes they appeared as widows, dressed in mourning black, offering prayers over the graves of strangers. Sometimes they appeared as nurses in traveling camps, dispensing tonics to the sick. Always they vanished before suspicion could take root. The witness in Denver. In December, a banker's clerk named Robert Malloy collapsed during a business dinner in Denver. His skin broke into blotches, his breath rattled, and he whispered a name before dying: Margaret. Investigation revealed that 2 women had dined at the same hotel that week, vanishing before authorities arrived. Witnesses described one pale, one dark-haired, both striking, both with voices that lingered in memory like perfume. For the first time, the fear of the sisters reached the cities. They were no longer confined to mountain legends. They walked among crowded streets. The cave revisited. When snow returned that winter, a few reckless men sought again the cavern in the bluffs, hoping to find treasure or relics. What they found was ash and stone. Sheriff Callahan had ordered the place burned, yet beneath the char, hidden in cracks of the rock, lay more vials, sealed tight, their liquid still bright and clear despite the fire. One man opened a vial, inhaled its contents, and collapsed into seizure. He did not live to see sunrise. The survivors buried the vials deep, praying never to see them again. But the truth remained. The sisters' work could not be undone by fire. It endured, preserved in glass and memory. Toward the horizon. By 1885, sightings placed the sisters on trains bound westward. Some said San Francisco, others whispered of Mexico. What was certain was this: the frontier had given them room to grow bold, but now they sought something greater, crowds to disappear into, ports to escape from, cities where their science could thrive unseen. The West remembered them in rumor and in graves, but the East had yet to meet them. The frontier was built on forgetting. Camps sprang up and vanished. Graves went unmarked. Names dissolved into wind and dust. But there are stories the land refuses to let die, and among them is the shadow of the Holloway sister. Even as the 1880s drew toward their close, whispers clung to the mountains. Men swore they had seen 2 women disembark from trains at night, veiled and traveling light. Others claimed to have heard voices, familiar, melodic, floating from abandoned shacks or from the woods at twilight. And in the records of county clerks and coroners, patterns endured: sudden deaths by apoplexy, lungs blackened with mineral consumption, veins stiff and brittle as glass. None of these deaths made the papers beyond a passing note. Yet when grouped together, they told a story the nation refused to read. The Last Witness. In the spring of 1885, Anna Whitfield, the survivor who had once fled their tavern with a torn arm and iron in her voice, was summoned to Denver by Marshal Callahan. She found him older, thinner, yet still driven by the hunt that had consumed him for years. He presented her with a collection of affidavits: farmers, rail workers, a nurse in Santa Fe. Each spoke of women matching the Holloway description. Each swore they had been offered a draft or ton. Some claimed recovery, others near death. Anna was asked to testify once more.
to put into the official record what she had endured. She did, though she confessed the strangest truth, that even in memory, she could not recall their faces clearly. They changed with the light, she said. They were one person, then another. I could not fix them on paper if I tried. Her statement was filed, then buried beneath legal jargon. Denver, eager for progress, wanted no more ghosts. Financial echoes. When accountants traced deeds in the boom towns, they found curious gaps. Saloons sold and resold under false names. Bank accounts opened with sudden wealth, then drained to nothing in weeks. In one vault, an unsigned promissory note promised repayment for ingredients, glass and instruments. No one claimed the note. No bank officer could identify the handwriting. Yet one clerk swore the script resembled that of a physician he had once seen in Leadville, a man who vanished in 1881, rumored to have fled east. Thus the money trail ended, as everything else tied to the sisters ended, in medicine's dark inheritance. By 1886, fragments of the Holloway ledger surfaced again. One page was found among the belongings of a Colorado physician who died of laudanum poisoning. Another turned up in a university archive mislabeled as notes on Indian remedy. Medical students whispered about it. Instructions on slowing the pulse, recipes for resilient tissues, timings of pain against lunar cycles. To some, it was nonsense. To others, forbidden knowledge. Quietly, a few attempted the formula. One injection left a dog twitching for hours after death. Another produced a state of paralysis mistaken for coma. None of the experiments were published, but the notes circulated in dim lecture halls, folded in pockets, handed from one reckless hand to another. The sisters' shadow had entered medicine itself. The Marshals' collapse. Marshal Callahan pursued them longest. He rode as far as New Orleans, where dockhands spoke of veiled women embarking for Havana. He sailed to Galveston, where a barmaid recalled two strangers offering restorative bitters. Each lead ended the same: a day late, a town behind. In 1887, his body was found in a Denver boarding house, a pistol at his side and an empty vial on the floor. The coroner listed suicide, but those who had known him whispered otherwise. The vial bore no label. His lips were darkened, his veins rigid. It was as though the sisters had claimed him after all. One final victory over the man who pursued them. With his death, the last official effort to hunt the sisters ended. The vanishing. From 1887 onward, the Holloway name appears no more in court records or newspapers. No confirmed sightings, no affidavits, no death certificates, as if they had dissolved into the air. But legends persist.